Welcome back, everyone. Here are today's objectives. Use base 10 blocks to model decimal numbers and write decimal numbers as fractions. On the screen up at the top, we have our place value chart. On the left, if you think back, this is our whole number place value, ones, tens, hundreds, and thousands. And then off to the right, we have our decimal place value, tenths, hundredths, and thousandths. The thousandths being our smallest place value because it's furthest over to the right. Down below on the screen, you'll see that there is a grid right here. We're going to think of this grid as 1. And then next to it, we have our decimal place values. We have tenth and we have hundredth. If you look at the tenth, normally in base 10 blocks, we would call this a long. We can use this to model both regular numbers as well as decimals. Today we're using it for decimals. If you look at this, we call this a tenth because this would be 1 out of 10 if you were to fill up the whole grid with those. So each one of these we call a tenth. If we look now at the cube, for decimals, we're going to refer to this as hundredth because if you look here, if I scooch over this cube onto the grid, you can see that it would take a lot of those cubes. It would take 100 of those cubes to cover the whole thing, okay, or to make the number 1. So since it takes 100 of these, we're going to call this a hundredth. So we're going to use the longs to represent our tenths place and the cubes to represent our hundredths place. We're going to think of the grid that we're laying them on as the number 1 or the whole. Decimals can be written as fractions. If we take a look at the fraction here, we have 5 over 10. The top number is what you are counting. So we're counting 5 of something. The bottom is the total number of parts in the whole. You can see here this is 10. So what this means is we're counting 5 things out of 10 parts in the whole. If we look now off to the right, you can see the yellow. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bars. Remember, each of these bars or longs represent tenths. So we have 5 of these tenths on our grid. In words, that looks like 5 tenths, but as a fraction, the part we're counting, the yellow part, goes on top, that's the 5, and the number of parts in the whole thing, if the whole grid was filled up with yellows, there would be 10 of them. So as a fraction, we read it 5 tenths. And in words, we can see that match over here, 5 tenths. We're going to match this language up with our decimal place value that we're already familiar with. If we look over here at the side, we have 0 decimal point 2. We read this as 2 tenths. If you think back to the place value chart, here's where the decimal would be. We have one number over to the right of the decimal. This is the tenths place. So we want to form 2 tenths using our base 10 blocks. So over here, remember the yellow represents the longs or the tenths, and I would put 2 of them on here. This is 1 tenth and 2 tenths. If I want to write that out as a fraction, I would write 2 on top because those are the pieces, oopsies, those are the pieces that I am counting. We'll go ahead and erase that quickly here and rewrite that. So we put 2 on top because that's what we're counting. And then on the bottom, I'm going to write 10 because these are tenths. We know that it would take 10 of these to fill up the whole thing. So as a decimal, it's 0 decimal point 2. As a fraction, we have 2 over 10. And we read both of these as 2 tenths. THS for that decimal place value. Let's take a look at another example. This time, we have 5 tenths. We know it's tenths because there's one digit to the right up here, tenths place, 5 tenths. So that means that I'm going to pull over 5 of my tenths. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. This is how I would represent 5/10 using my blocks. As a fraction, I'm going to put what I'm counting, 5, on top. And then the whole, parts in the whole, there would be 10 parts in that whole grid. So 10 goes on the bottom. If I were to write it in words, it would be F-I-V-E, 5, and T-E-N-T-H-S for tenths, 5/10. Let's go ahead and look at another example. This time, I have 2 digits to the right. And on my place value chart, 2 digits over, I know I'm talking about hundredths. So what you're looking at is 2 hundredths. Remember that the tenths were represented with the longs, the yellows, and now we're going to look at hundredths. So we need the blues. So I have 2 hundredths. That's going to take 2 blue cubes. You can see that hundredths are smaller. Remember that place value chart, how I told you it gets smaller as you go to the right? Look at how big the tenth is here compared to the hundredths. So 2 hundredths is a very small number. As a fraction, if we write that out, we're going to write what we're counting on top. I'm counting 2 blocks out of 100. If we were to fill the whole thing with those little cubes, it would take 100 of them. So this is how we write 2 hundredths as a fraction. Here's another example. This time instead of 2 hundredths, I have 5 hundredths, which means I'm going to need 5 of those cubes on my grid. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. This is how we'd represent 5 hundredths with our cubes. As a fraction, how do you think that's going to be written? Take a minute to think about it. 5 will go on top. What's going to go on the bottom? 100. So we read this, remember, as 5 hundredths, T-H-S, 5 hundredths. Here's another one. This time we have 2 digits here. We have a 1 and a 3. So I read this as 13. And then because I'm 2 digits over, I'm going to say the word hundredths, 13 hundredths. That means I need 13 of these blue cubes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oopsies, the screen's going a little crazy there. 6, 7, 8. Oh, it's going crazy again. 8, 9, and 10. Now notice I could have used a tenth there to fill up all this space. That's what this 1 represents. We have 1/10 and 3 extra hundredths. Or we can just use all blue cubes and count out 13 hundredths. It's the same thing. We're going to talk more about that actually in our next lesson. So this would be 13 hundredths if I were using all the blue hundredths. And then I want to write the fraction, so I'm going to put my 13 on top. That's what I've just been counting. And then 100 on the bottom. Moving right along. Let's look at one more example here. This time I have a 2 and a 0. There's 2 ways to read this. I could just look at the 2 and know that since there's a 0 here, I don't need to read that place value. Then I would read this as 2 tenths because it's 1 digit over to the right in the tenths place. The other way to read it as it would be to read the 2 digits together and say 20, and then because this is the second place over, say hundredths. So I could read this as 20 hundredths, or I could read it as 2 tenths. It's the exact same thing, just 2 different ways to read it. It will look a little bit different with the blocks. Let me show you. If we do the first example of 2 tenths, we would put on 2 of our tenths here. And then we are going to go ahead and write that fraction. It would be 2, that's what we're counting, over 10. If we fill the whole thing with yellows, there would be 10 of them on there. So this would be 2 tenths. Or the other way to think about it would be to use 20 of these blue cubes. Now remember, there's 10 in a long, so I'm not actually going to put all those cubes on there. That would take a while. But you can see that if I did put them all on here, we'd have 10 here and 10 here, which would be 20 hundredths. Takes up the same amount of space, so these numbers are equal to each other. If I were to write it as a fraction, it would look a little different. We would put our 20 on top. And then what do you think the bottom number would be? Since we're not counting tenths, we're counting hundredths. The bottom number would be, that's right, it would be 100. So 2/10 is actually equal to 20 hundredths. It's the same number. All right, now we're going to do a little bit of comparisons, and we're going to think about which number is greater. In order to do this, we have to know how to read the decimals. There's one place value. Remember, this is our tenths place, so we read this as 5/10. What we want to do is show the cubes on the grid, and that will help us to see which is greater. Let's go ahead and get some more of these here. We are going to clone them, which means I get a whole bunch of them. So if we have 5/10, that would be 1, 2, 3. Uh-oh, where did our other guy go? Let's bring him back here. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, our whole grid's moving. Oh no, oh no. Let's stop it. 1, 2, 3, 4, and do we have 5 there? Let's count from the bottom. 1, 2, 3, 4. Nope, that's only 4. There we go. Always good to double check our work, right? Get them on there. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. You're going to be coloring these in your math journal, so it'll be definitely a little bit easier to make sure you have the right amount. But what's showing up here now would be our 5/10, and then we need to do our second grid, which we have 2 digits. Remember, the second place over is hundredths, so this is 7 hundredths. That means cubes, so we need to put 7 of them on there. Let's go ahead and clone this friend here, infinite cloner. There we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. All right, now when we look at our grids, we want to think about which is greater. That means which of these two grids has more space filled in. You can see there's a whole bunch more space filled in with our yellow than there is with our blue. So 5/10 would be the greater number. 5/10 is more than 7 hundredths. Remember, alligator's mouth eats the bigger number. Chomp, chomp. That's how we would represent that. Let's do one more. Thinking about this one, we want to think about which is greater, 3 hundredths or 72 hundredths. If I was going to show 3 hundredths, we would want to go ahead and use these blue cubes. So we're going to move them up to the grid. We'd have 1, 2, and 3. There's 3 hundredths. And we want to compare that to 72 hundredths. Now notice it's 2 digits, so I want to think about them. I could think about them separately. I could put on 7/10 and 2 hundredths, or I could take 72 hundredths, 72 little cubes, and put them on there. That would take me a long time. So I think I'm going to think about this as 7/10. So we're going to go ahead and get 7 of these tenths and put them on there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. There's my 7/10. What am I missing? I'm missing these 2 hundredths. So I'm going to go over here to my cubes and put 2 of them on there. Now that I have my picture done, I can go back and think about my question. Which is greater? That means which number is more? We can definitely see that this grid has a lot more on it than the grid over here does. So 72 hundredths is greater than 3 hundredths. I'm going to go ahead and write in my symbol just like that. That's it for today. It's quiz time. Please log on and take your quiz right after you finish watching the video. Remember, you can always go back and rewatch it or go back to certain examples that you want to see again. That's it, and have a great day, everybody. Bye.